morning from rainy Northern California, where we are absolutely thrilled that it's still raining. I just wanted to see people, but I guess I'm going to see your blank screens. I know one person looks like she's cooking breakfast or preparing lunch. Hi, Gina. So anyway, yes, so this might be a little bit of a pivot, but maybe it's also a response to the prior session on kind of how do we have power around mobilizing the collective. So I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank our sponsors and the Futures Festival organizers, and what a terrific and timely event. I listed this session as a roundtable because I wanted a way to engage participants. So roll up your sleeves and get prepared to work with me, because this is very much a thought project. And it really requires a dialogue, because my aim is to look at how to build a bridge between advocacy and foresight. And I know that I have a colleague out there, Clem Biesold, and I may call on him to help me with a little bit of this presentation, because he has really been in this arena for a long time and made such great progress. So now I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to, so I initially titled this session very quickly, and I made a little change to the title, which was to emphasize that it's not just systems change we're talking about. When we talk about advocacy as a vehicle for change, it's so much more. And today, what we'll do, hopefully together, is really take a little time to understand what advocacy is in terms of political actors or advocates. We also call them activists. They are probably called many other things in many different languages, and talk a little about what they do and why they do it. In terms of advocacy as a force for change, we'll talk about 4 types of change, not just systems change. And then I want to engage us in a discussion to talk about the intersection and see where we might want to go next. So a little bit about me. I'm not going to read the entire slide, but it does start this path to we, which has actually been converging and overlapping paths, started in 1985 when I worked at the Institute for Alternative Futures in Alexandria, Virginia. And so basically I started in the future and I've worked backwards. That's how this works out. So, but one of the key things that I worked on with Clem was a project around this principle of anticipatory democracy. And at the time it was almost one anticipatory democracy group per state. And these are basically community-based initiatives to infuse foresight into democracy projects of many different kinds. With that, I progressed to going into the field that I've always been very passionate about, or health. Health is broadly defined as you can think about it, but I was particularly interested in a place-based approach to thinking about health, or healthy communities. And in many ways, this comes out of WHO's Healthy Cities initiative, start in the 80s. And it was all about how you could have a site for empowerment, how you could actually change the structure or the conditions around you, how it could be participatory. And moreover, it's very vision driven. There's actually vision development embedded in the process of a Healthy Communities initiative. And from there, I took a pivot, and which is probably a good thing, but it becomes very arcane and technical. I was training to be a political scientist, and it seemed like public policy was the place for me in health. But I also really decided that it was all about upstream change around increasing the quality of healthcare, access to healthcare, and trying to move us to a rights discussion or health for all. And it took me into all sorts of very political science, public policy waters around intergovernmental relations and the role of the state. And I came to love counties, because as a site of power and change, they're actually very flexible and nimble. And if they've got money, which is always the linchpin, they can make great things happen. And then more recently, as an evaluator, I took yet another pivot, but it all comes back and relates to everything around understanding advocacy and its role in change. And this is all part of a 9-year evaluation. We had lots of data. We were documenting advocates and what they were doing. And that's sort of brought us up to the current point. So that's a lot, but that's kind of what my thinking has, how broad and how deep it's gone. And I just want to touch on a couple of milestones that in the last few years that are informing this talk today. One of them is that my co-author, Claire Brindis, and I co-wrote an evaluation guide on how to evaluate advocacy and policy change initiatives. And this was as part of our evaluation work at the University of California, San Francisco. But what I want to call out for today is that we developed and documented 6 case studies, which I'm going to weave through this talk, because I believe one of the themes of our day today is to talk about actual cases and examples where communities and in this case, advocates are the lens, have really been able to be successful in achieving change. The other part of this, which is something that I think could be helpful to the Foresight community, is to look at the scholarship on advocacy, public policy, nonprofit management, and kind of understand the scholarship and where they come together. Typically, you'll find sociologists look at policymaking through a group lens, political scientists look at public policy and political actors, and then there's a whole burgeoning area looking at how nonprofits have become more vocal advocates, not just providing services, but having a policy emphasis in their work. And last, this was also a field building enterprise. So we actually put in one place a lot of the literature and research on policymaking, on advocacy. The other thing I'm going to draw on is that I'm working on a project with my colleagues at the Alliance for Justice and Strengthening Democracy, Sue Hochstetter and Shannon Williams. Their pictures are on the right. And we just recently administered and have analyzed data, nonprofits that engage in advocacy, and we've got a reasonable response rate. And I'm going to present some of that data to kind of like, because I want to provide the sort of the reality of advocacy and what they achieve. But I do have a little data, so bear with me. So let's do a quick poll. And I'm not actually sure how this poll will work, but we're going to do it super quick. I just want to know who's in the audience. Just answer yes or no. Oops. Are you an advocate who regularly engages in advocacy? And I'm not going to define advocacy yet. Are you involved in policymaker at the international? Are you involved in policymaking at, say, the international, national, or local level? And also, do you engage in public sector foresight? If you do, you'll know who you are. All right, let's run the poll.
The poll is running, Annette. Thank you. You won't be able to see it since you're a co-host, but we have 14 people who have answered so far out of the 37 who can answer. Yes, we've got 17 answers. Please, everyone, if you'd like to answer the poll, it's just 3 yes or no questions. 19 answers. All right, I'll close this.
All right. Okay, so I have the data on my screen. I'm just going to look at it very quickly and comment. Okay, so we have some advocates or activists, okay? And that helps me know where to kind of go with doing an overview of advocacy, and then some, and I don't know if it's the same 6 people are also involved in policymaking, but there's probably a good correlation there. And then public sector foresight, more so there than which is helpful to know because they'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about policy. And quite a few that might be newcomers to this arena. So we will just make sure that we are not drilling too far in or going too far into the weeds. So I'm going to share the poll. Let me stop this. How do I get rid of this? I'm saying, I knew that there would be of glitchiness on my part about going between the poll and people can see my screens. Great. All right, here we go. So now we have a sense of who we are and probably enough knowledge and expertise to have a reasonable discussion. So let's talk about advocacy. And I'm going to pick up with post-2016 because we think that there's been some real shifts in advocacy. Again, I have to preface that this is very much from a sort of a US-centric perspective, but a lot of the concepts really translate across different cultures, different countries, and there'll be some commonalities, but these pictures here will be from the US. And I wanted to say that, you know, for many of us, advocacy is something we know when we see it, but unless we're experienced advocates ourselves, we might not have as robust an understanding of what it is and what it achieves. And so, for example, in this slide, you can see that, right, you know, we've seen a lot of turning out for protests and marches here in the US, you know, similar in other places such as the Arab Spring. So when we see lots of people, we think advocacy, but wait, there's more. I'm going to provide a definition. It's that, and I use this very broad definition because we want it to be inclusive, you know, as championing, supporting, or opposing a cause or a policy. But if you take a look at this word cloud, it's so much more than that. It's very nuanced. It has a lot to do with rights, with people, with services, with people's concerns, with society. It's a very, you know, we cast our net very, very wide here. I'm going to give you this is just a quick nuts and bolts because I'm not always sure we appreciate how crowded, complex, and fluid the advocate arena is. And I've broken it out by individuals, organizations, and groups. And then all the different types of individuals, groups, and organizations. Some of this might be familiar. Some of this is from the political science literature, like issue networks. But I just want to point out that even government and policymakers are advocates. And in fact, I would argue that we're all advocates. We might not always know it, but once we show up, when we vote, when our voices are heard, we are advocating. And we advocate in many different venues. This is just the short list, but advocates, particularly trained advocates, are very active in administrative advocacy. This would be working with public agencies to craft rules and regulations. Legislative advocacy is a particularly prized, or not prized, but important focus, or influencing decision makers at the federal, state, and local, such as the Board of Supervisors. Electoral advocacy, we're all familiar with that. You know, what we do to get out the vote, to influence people's understanding of the issues. And then litigation is not so much used, but it's becoming an area of opportunity. It does require resources. And then corporate advocacy, where can we actually go and make a difference around the private sector actors? For those people who are knowledgeable about policymaking, this should look pretty obvious. And I don't really want to read all the stages except to show the progression around advocacy and at its activities. And so in the way to think of this is advocacy capacities is pre-policy. It's the community organizing, the media work, it's partnerships, it's building organizational capacity to do advocacy. And then what kicks in is a cycle that many of you should be familiar with, is what, as you are moving closer and closer to actually having a particular piece of legislation that's voted on and passed and then implemented. But just to point out, in terms of complexity, these are all the places in the process that advocates can act. And I just think that sometimes the images, you know, boils it down a little more clearly, that we typically think of getting the message out in the early stages of advocacy, not always with bullhorns, could be with the media. That also there's a point when we start having public testimony and people come in to present their research, their opinions, their views, and target it to policymakers. And then, but the interesting thing is, when does advocacy become a sort of roll up your sleeves, sit down at the table and craft the nuts and bolts of a piece of legislation? And that sounds like a very sort of dull activity to observe, but truly that's where the real power lies for many things, like how much funding and who gets to who's the physical agent, and how are the contracts developed, and what are the parameters of a piece of policy, and that is actually a very potent place to exert power. Talking about power, I will talk about that in a second. The other thing I just want us to appreciate, that this is not an easy linear path forward to achieve change. And many, and particularly along with the philanthropists that I've been working with, policymaking is a huge lever for change, but it's not easy going. It happens in multiple places. Political culture will vary by policy area. The time horizon can be as long as 17 years or never. You have big P policies like laws, you have little p policies like guidelines. I mean, this is not an easy road to go down. And I just want to call out that this should sound familiar to us as futurists, that we wrestle with the same issues around complexity, nonlinearity, or systems, and a long time horizon to see the effects of our activities. So what do advocates do? And these are like the obvious answers: get out the vote, get people out, but it's so much more. And a lot of it has to do with, that we're really in it to assert power, to be in relationships, to figure out who has power or who doesn't. And some of this is about voice, who's being heard, and why or why not. And where is power situated? And there's some reasonably good models to work with, like this power cube that we translate in evaluation practice into metrics. But this is an elusive, fluid concept. But for us, if we're new to advocacy, this is the kind of thing we have to have a grip on to be effective. And okay, I do have some data. I won't belabor it and go into the detail, but I just wanted to tell you, though, that there are so many ways to assert power, to influence, to expand your reach that we ask advocates about. And this list has actually been fairly rigorously developed and tested over many years so that we could see the universe of of advocacy. And a lot of it is very complicated, like coalition work, public awareness campaigns, policymaker education. And just looking at that diversity tells you a lot about the capacity to do advocacy. And in our sample of respondents, advocates do on average 9.82 of these activities. So it's not just a one type of advocacy for one organization. You employ these tactics in a toolkit. You're savvy about which is applicable where and under what circumstances and who your target audience is. So again, we're just developing an appreciation of advocacy and how it translates into being a vehicle for change, the operational side. And then just the other side of this equation, again, talking about policy, is that, advocates will target more than one policy issue. And I just put here the ones that our sample were most engaged in. And it makes sense that voter or civic engagement is the highest rated. In other years, it's been health. Also that civil and human rights has moved up. But and what you really care about is, where are they not targeting? And I would have thought immigration would have been a little higher up, and maybe employment and jobs will go higher up as we have this phenomenon where people are not going back to their jobs. Maybe another type of advocacy. I will admit, I'm still admitting people, so that I get those, it flags me to admit people. So okay. All right. So let's talk about a policy issue and an advocacy campaign and bring them together into one case study that we developed for the book. So with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in the United States in 2011, funders actually engaged in doing, paying for, in this case, a public will building campaign to have the residents of the state of Colorado talk about healthcare, how it can be improved, how can they be part of the discussion. And a lot of this was around discussion, using social media, community forums, story collection, and mobilizing people. And so laying the groundwork for successful implementation of the Affordable Care Act, which was one of our largest policies ever. I think I devoted a good 6 years of my life to the details of it. And I would call my advocacy research advocacy. We published quite a bit in the way of data about why this was a good idea and who would have access to care. That tends to be my Kuleana or bailiwick. I just want to note again how complex this can get. But again, if you're looking for particular places to make change, you want to know where advocates are active. And a lot of advocates in the US are active at the state and local and national and federal levels. They may have multiple foci. And that is if you're looking at capacity and what to leverage, you can find advocacy organizations and individuals that are particularly effective at multiple levels, which is a good thing when you want to do a big campaign. So here's an example of what I mean. So this was a transportation initiative targeting US policies for equitable and sustainable transportation options, dealing with in many cases, a declining or decaying transportation system and trying to move it to something that is not only more efficient, but also more equitable. This campaign was active at the federal, state, and local levels. It had demonstration projects. It had an array of advocacy around research. It had a vision development piece that I want to call out that is not typical. But that's not so difficult to envision in this arena. So let's just pause. I'm happy to take questions. I'm not always that good at reading them all, but I just wanted to check in, what's new? Are you seeing the parallels to foresight? And see if anybody wanted to chime in. I can look at the chat. I'm not sure everybody's see. Okay, so we're not getting participation that way. Rudolph, sorry. What would you like to tell us or talk about?
Hello, Annette.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that advocacy is really good to have at a multiple level, like local, state, and sort of regional spaces. How do you find that collaboration plays a role within advocacy, where you would see faith communities, NGOs, local governance entities actually working together on specific issues, instead of just, let's say, advocates that are just standing behind the cause themselves? How would this multi-sector collaboration be significant in terms of really getting leverage and getting momentum for these issues?
Sure, and some of that will vary by the type of policy issue and the extent to which it's a crowded field of political actors. But there's a few vehicles. One of them is this coalition approach, and there's been some foundation support to help shape the coalition. And we typically refer to these partnerships as advocacy allies, and they're fluid. For one particular policy issue, the allies might be working in tandem and the coalition is the vehicle for synchronicity and creating, reducing redundancy and increasing, power in numbers, but having it be more organized. But as the policy terrain shifts, these allies may actually become competitive, and then they will dissolve. They will wax and wane. We've seen that. We ask questions about collaboration, types of partnerships, the dimensions. I like the Wilder Factors collaboration inventory. In fact, there's a whole list of instruments to assess the nature of a collective group of advocates.
When we look at the context in Africa, in many spaces, there are not very good systems or, let's say, structures to actually get people mobilized. So one of the, let's say, most organized groups in many countries in Africa is the church. And they can communicate with many people, but they're often not communicating with one another. So it's the biggest network, but it's not the biggest cohesive network.
Right.
And so I'm wondering that even when you involve these, let's say, these natural structures amongst people, how do you actually bring people together for your cause, even though they might not all be talking to one another, even having the same voice about the scores?
Right. I'll answer that real quickly, and then I'll keep moving because I have a case that might help with that. Set in one of the sites is in Africa. So how do you do that ground level work of aligning people? And this is why I think vision development could be a really important part of that picture. So if you will hold, I'm going to keep going and illustrate that with a really good case, because it's some of this is to remember that there are lots of other stakeholders, development groups. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. We did education, small business. So there are many other enterprises that come at this question. So let's talk about the types of change. And again, I told you it wasn't just systems change, but we'll talk about changing lives, social norms, and expanding democracy. And I'm hoping we answer Rudolph's question with these cases, because some of this is, how do you have that overlay of an organizing force? So here's an example of systems change where Oxfam invested in a multi-year campaign to tackle food injustice. It's an international piece with activities at national, regional, and international levels. And what it was is it still is. Okay, some of these things don't stop, and sometimes that's the answer to our question, is that we keep going on a particular type of campaign and keep shoring up the infrastructure, the communications, the relationship development piece. And this one was really interesting to us because it also targeted private sector decision-making, in particular the World Bank and their portfolio. And also they did a video project with the rock group Coldplay. So they were really very nimble and they invested resources. And that's also the important piece, are the resources you put into this endeavor. For changing lives, and this is again back to Rudolph's question, this was a different approach. This was a fellowship program to train girls and organize around empowering girls in their communities in 4 countries to reach out to policymakers, to weigh in on policy, to get the word out, to march, to hold policymakers in their local communities accountable. And this project, again, I'm trying to remember who did this one. I was thinking, well, the Public Health Institute was involved, and I'm blanking on the funder, but again, these are philanthropists or large advocate organizations like Oxfam that are playing a leadership role in bringing together the stakeholders and building advocacy capacity and providing support around navigating the policy arena. In terms of social norms, this was a great case about 5 tribal nations in the US to target tobacco in their communities. And here the issue is casinos. which allow smoking on the premises and expose their workers to secondhand smoke. And this being a public health initiative, that, this is a problem. So in addition to empowering these 5 tribal nations to deal with this on a policy level around smoking in casinos, it was also an opportunity to have the community understand tobacco in a way that it had traditionally understood it, or as a sacred medicine, and moving it away from the typical pack of cigarettes, and smoking as a regular habit, but more as a sacred activity. And then this last one on expanding democracy is a case about Pew. The Pew Foundation launched 2 multi-year campaigns, one in Canada and one in Australia, and worked with Indigenous peoples to assert their rights over native lands, and worked with them on the skills that they could use to sit down at the table. And this is really a very core concept that we use to kind of sort of in many ways the essence of advocacy, which is it is better to be at the table than to be on the menu. And that's what happened here. It continues on as a program. They've been pretty successful, particularly in changing the role of Indigenous peoples with respect to their lands, such as a stewardship role. So that is my set of cases, the data we have on advocates, what they do, where they do it, how complex their arena is, their fit in the policy making arena. And what I wanted to move us toward is this discussion, and I'm hoping I have enough time, because I really think I could learn from this very rich and large group of people. How do we bring foresight and advocacy together? And I'm going to end with a little bit of data before we launch into our discussion, but here's a list of the ways I've been thinking about this. And I put at the top of the list this idea that as futurists, we need to increase our advocacy capacity to advocate for the future. We mention it, we talk about letter writing, and the public foresight futurists will have a more intimate sort of understanding of what does it mean to be in that policy making arena. But in terms of making our voices heard and moving towards that collaborative around the future, advocating the future, I think there's more that we could do there and be a little more organized and do a little more capacity development. The other thing thought I've had is that that foresight and advocacy are very similar. They're both about creating a preferred future. They're empowerment approaches, and they share this commitment to democracy building. The third way I've been thinking about this is to think about the public sector foresight arena and how we understand the actors and their roles and how we engage them more in foresight, and not always just targeting decision makers, which is where a lot of advocacy gets funneled, or the lens is around decision makers. And then this last point I've been thinking about is how do we as futurists think about the future of advocacy? And one is that we can put more vision into advocacy, work with advocates to think about their vision beyond just establishing or passage of a policy. One is to think about infusing more anticipatory democracy principles into our place-based initiatives, and more broader than that, and maybe even into the metaverse, right? Anticipatory democracy in the metaverse. I love it. And then we could work with advocates to make them better in anticipating and understanding change. So those are my thoughts. The only piece of data I have, and I'll close with this before the discussion, is that we took this survey as an opportunity to ask about change, recent change in the advocacy community. And we asked about, well, how did their work change due to the coronavirus and to the social justice movement here in the US. And what we see is that they have changed, the majority have changed their strategy and tactics. In terms of the pandemic, it's this move to a virtual environment, both doing tactics and communicating. And we also see that they have adopted, in terms of racial equity, they've been adjusting their mission, their goals, their strategy, in broadening the conversation. So that's the little nugget of knowledge we have to build on about what the future might hold for advocacy. So I'm going to thank everybody, my partners, Sue and Shannon, the evaluation community for really bringing together the book and the thinking in this arena, my partners at UCSF, and my two friends and mentors, Jim Dater and Clem Biesold. And please reach out to me if you want to take this conversation further offline. But if I've got some time, I'm going to pull up the questions that we can nosh on. And I will put us back to gallery mode so I can see people or whoever wishes to be seen, and also answer some questions. So, there's Clem, welcome. I'm so glad you can just, I thought it would be helpful if we've got a minute, if you would explain what anticipatory democracy is to the group, but you'll have to unmute.
I'll have to ask you to unmute, Clem.
Great. Repeat the question, Annette.
Sure. I was hoping you could provide a brief overview of what is anticipatory democracy.
Okay, great. So well, let me just say, great presentation, Annette. It sort of is a fascinating overview of your trajectory integrating research, foresight, advocacy, and evaluation. So anticipatory democracy, and I have a couple comments on foresight and advocacy and their relationship, but anticipatory democracy is people in the people in the politics of the future was the phrase that Alvin Toffler used at the end of his book, Future Shock, to say what should be done. It was his prescription for Future Shock, was anticipatory democracy. And it had, it's got a broad meaning in the sense that it is more effective democracy, policymaking participation with a futures context. And that futures context takes a number of dimensions. It includes having shared, genuine shared vision in the community or the organization. It takes understanding the context and the systems. It takes participation in doing that. And as you mentioned, when you were working with us in the 1980s, many states in the US had futures programs in many localities as well. And that those were prime examples in the 80s. Over time, the sense of anticipatory democracy has continued to evolve with both how we make decisions and how we communicate and how we think about things. So that's on that. For me, part of the comments about advocacy and foresight, advocacy is at one level a agency, taking your agency, you or your organization, and promoting your goals and objectives. And that can take many forms, as you pointed out, in terms of the policy spectrum. And so advocacy is doing that. You identified the need for advocacy to be aware of its system and the levers and the influences and in the various levels. Foresight is thinking about the future, identifying vision, aspirations, putting those together with assumptions about what's changing in the environment and what's changing in the system, and ultimately linking that to your strategy objectives and doing that in a way that involves participation. The one thing that is interesting, and as I was reflecting on your description is agency. I, in much of my foresight work, am not exercising my agency. I'm enabling others to become wiser in understanding and shaping their goals, values, and what might be happening. And so there is a policy analysis type of function for foresight that might involve your agency or it might not. Whereas advocacy is always involving the direction of your agency, your agency to be able to do something and shape something. So those are the just quick comments. Oh, and the other comment I wanted to make is, as you were describing it, at the very end, you said that gave an example of racial equity as a dominant value. And I think that both in terms of understanding foresight and agency are the questions of what are their universal vision? Is there, and how is that changing? And how does that relate to goals or policies? And I'd say that the closest thing we have to audacious goals, globally shared audacious goals that represent operationalizing a humanity's vision are the Sustainable Development Goals. And so there is out there, and for anticipatory democracy, this is a big thing. And the Sustainable Development Goals represent operationalizing humanity's, the closest thing we have to humanity's shared vision at the time. One of the trends within that is the rise of equity. You can see the rise of equity, in particular racial equity, throughout the world, in business, commerce, government. And there are, and it's been rising for decades now. There are trends and counter forces, such as the rise of nationalism and other things here in the US in recent years. But there is a fundamental trend which I think drives the pursuit, the understanding of vision and the pursuit of that. And those are all important, both in terms of understanding, doing foresight in any given field and in advocating for that. So
and I thank you for those comments, and I'm very sorry that this session has to end soon. And I was trying to figure out how to continue this conversation because we have so many, and I'm looking at the chat room, but just to sort of sum up that this whole thing about structure and agency and how can futurists help shape or guide or actually have agency be its own force, its own self-guided but vision-based force. So that's one thing. But I wanted to see if there was any questions that have to be answered right now, or can we just sign off? But maybe I'll work with the Association of Professional Futurists to see if there's a way to keep this moving along as a conversation, because I think agency is a critical component of talking about collaboration, not just how you organize it, fund it, and have these desired outcomes, because we can measure this. That's what we do in evaluation, is to understand how effective agency can be in different situations, policies, and activities. So with that, I will thank you for the time to talk with you today, and knowing that 45 minutes is not enough, and hopefully we'll continue the discussion. So with that, I will say